I want to preface this video by making a broad statement about games. More than anything, the 3D platformer is by far my favorite genre in all of gaming. I love Super Mario 64, I love Rayman 2, I also enjoy lesser known experiences in the genre such as Pac-Man World. As long as there is significant amounts of platforming involved, I will usually be able to find enjoyment in the title. I think the biggest thing that draws me to 3D platformers over anything else is their simplicity. In 3D platformers, you're typically playing as one single character, and with that character, you are moving around various levels, if you will. Sometimes those levels are open world, sometimes they are closed, single path levels, but it all boils down to you having control over a single sprite, or guy, or whatever you want to call them, and you're advancing that sprite through what are essentially obstacle courses to make it to the end goal. And yet, even though this is such a bare-bones concept that sounds almost primitive if you really think about it, platformers still manage to create this ethereal sense of freedom and adventure that is difficult to find anywhere else. So at the end of the day, when I discuss a 3D platformer, there will almost always be a little bit of bias on my end, unless of course the thing just completely sucks. And that's where Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos, comes in. Because if you don't know, now you know, Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos is a 3D platformer that was released in September 1997 to mixed acclaim. On one hand, it was criticized for its controls, and also for being a widely derivative clone of more relevant titles of the time. It rips the 3D exploration style straight from Super Mario 64, and also incorporates that same lose all your items when you get hit system found in Sonic the Hedgehog. On the other hand, it was praised for being able to effectively blend these elements together to establish its own unique flavor, while also bringing to the table a unique in-game atmosphere as well as an extensive library of exceptional music and sound effects. It should also be noted that Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos, has developed somewhat of a cult following in recent years. Chalk it all up to nostalgia if you want, but there's no doubt that Croc has captured the hearts of many, many people through the years in spite of its glaring flaws. So I guess after all that, the question is, which side is more correct? Is Croc just a mediocre replica of popular 90s platformers that has no business being held in the same breath as them? Or is there more to it than people are willing to give it credit for? As an avid pursuer of 3D platformers, I am simultaneously excited and terrified of covering this title, because it's a given that I will find some enjoyment in it due to it literally being the very thing I just got done praising. I'm also worried as to how its blatant flaws will conflict with that enjoyment. I guess we'll just have to find out in the ensuing minutes and seconds, because this is Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos, deserves better. Or does it? Also, just throwing this out there, allegedly Croc was created by an outside company to act as a prototype for Nintendo's Super Mario 64, the most famous 3D platform of all time, so there's also that. Just thought I'd drop that knowledge on you, because it's pretty wild. Okay, Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos tells the story of a young crocodile who was found washed ashore on a mystical land inhabited by creatures known as the Gobbos. The Gobbos decide to adopt this young crocodile into the family, where he grows up living with the Gobbos as if he were one of their own. But one day, a rather terrifying-looking giant frog shows up and starts terrorizing and capturing all the Gobbos. This menacing giant frog is the big baddie of this universe, and he is known infamously as Baron Dante? Really? Forgettable name aside, Baron takes off with all the captured Gobbos, and it's up to one young crocodile who, we'll just call him Dwayne, sets out on a quest through 4 different worlds to take down Baron Dante. Seriously, what the hell is that name? He's a giant frog. And rescue all of the captured Gobbos. So the scene is set for you to begin your adventure. A pretty simple and inoffensive story that does the job of creating a reason for this adventure to happen. You could argue that they tried way too hard with creating this whole backstory of Croc being this lost child who at first is the odd man out in his own group, but ends up being the one who saves everybody in the end. I mean, that feels a little too overly dramatic for this kind of game, right? I would argue this opening scene is really well executed, mainly due to how surprisingly well the graphics and animation hold up. It may be a game from the PS1 era, but the way these sprites move in this cutscene is so fluid and smooth, and it's obvious great care was taken into constructing the whole thing. That same fluidity of animation carries over to other cutscenes too, most of which the screen time is dominated by our boy, Dante's Inferno. Man, this just looks so good for its time. I'd even go out on a limb in saying these scenes feel nearly cinematic. Maybe it's just me, but I swear that was a rarity for this time period, and it almost makes me forget that this is coming from what is considered to be a cheap Super Mario 64 knockoff. Like seriously, cutscenes this smooth have no business existing in a game that has the reputation of a paperclip. They even went as far as to include little comedic bits of the level bosses just awkwardly walking off after you just beat them. I love that. It's the little things like this that give personality to the critters that fill out this world, and that definitely puts it over for me. That same flawlessness apparently carries over to everything else as well, because you've essentially got the total package here. The music is incredible, the sound design is spot on, and every single level looks like it was made with care and attentiveness. Also, did I mention that the music is incredible? The best thing about the soundtrack is that each track does a great job of supporting the theme of the world it's encapsulating, whether it be music made for a snowy tundra, or music made for a wild, wild west-esque desert. The entire vibe of Croc does not in the slightest come off to me as a half-baked clone. Upon first impression, it feels like a serious gaming experience where time and effort was really put toward making for a quality presentation, and to tell you the truth, I am left flabbergasted by this. I admittedly went into this with low expectations simply due to my preconceived notions that this was just another Mario 64 clone, but from the start I can confidently say I was wrong, at least from a presentation standpoint. Croc, The Legend of the Gobbos looks and feels awesome. Now, the question is, does that level of quality carry over to the minute-to-minute gameplay? Well, you see, it kinda, Croc tries, it really tries, to create a fun platforming experience. You're advancing through 4 exclusively themed worlds that house around 6 levels each, with each level hosting your typical obstacle course to get through. As for the worlds themselves, they really did a nice job of establishing a sense of location for each one. The first world has you moving through your usual introductory grass world where everything feels light and playful, and any sense of impending danger is nowhere to be found. It's just a nice, peaceful tutorial world to help you get the hang of things in a low-stakes situation, and the platforming is pretty simple. The second world has you moving through a snowy tundra, and this is quite honestly my favorite of the bunch. It's got this festive vibe to it that just makes you feel happy as you're playing through it, and the music is just on point. I'm well aware that jingle bells are so overdone in winter music at this point, but you can't deny how well they work to establish the setting of being in the Arctic. It's also a nice step up from World 1 difficulty-wise without really throwing you to the wolves, although I'll admit the icy and thereby overly slippery ground you have to walk on got annoying really quickly, mainly because it does not complement the game's shoddy camera system at all. But I'll get to that later. These are just a couple of examples of how admirably Croc produces levels that are simply just enjoyable to exist in. I've seen many an argument complaining about how the platforming itself is too derivative of other games, and doesn't really do anything new or special with it. I mean, you're certainly not wrong about that. There are plenty of gimmicks here that have been done before. There's the platforms that drop after you've landed on them, there's hanging sections, climbing sections, and admittedly, Croc does not really play around with these basic fundamentals too much, outside of maybe the sections toward the end of the game where you're timing your jumps around whenever the Cookie Monster decides to slam his giant mallet and flip the platform in front of you, but even that feels a bit sus. Here's what I'll say about the platforming in Croc. While it doesn't introduce any new concepts to the mix, there really isn't anything wrong with what it does give us. Now, as I've said before, I'm biased toward platformers, so I am not that picky when it comes to my obstacle courses. I'm not usually thinking about whether or not what I'm playing is fresh or new or revolutionary to the art of platforming. I'm really just enjoying myself as I hop through these courses. What can I say? I'm easy to please. That's really what it boils down to. So to me, there is nothing wrong with Croc being rather uninspired in the gameplay department. I still had tons of fun while playing through it, for the most part, and I think that's in big part to, again, just how elegantly the whole package of Croc fits together. It looks nice, Croc and the rest of the cast are extremely charismatic, the music is just otherworldly, and the platforming, despite objectively being the weakest aspect of Croc overall, is serviceable enough, at least to me. The cherry on top of all this is that you get rewarded in the best way possible for going for 100% completion, with that reward simply being more content. Each level hosts 6 caged Gobbos for you to rescue, and for every few levels that you collect all the Gobbos, you unlock a secret level. In total, there are 8 secret levels for you to unlock, and they are all quite enjoyable in their own right. But it doesn't stop there, because once you collect all 8 jigsaw pieces found in all 8 secret levels, you are rewarded even further with a whole new 5th secret world for you to explore, complete with 4 extra levels and the true final boss of the entire game. I honestly cannot think of another game that hosts this much secret content. Croc understands that the best way to honor the efforts of a dedicated player above all else is by giving them, well, more game to play. Because presumably, if you're that committed to beating the game 100%, then it's likely you enjoy the game enough, at least to the point where receiving more content is something akin to finding a fresh Nintendo 64 under your Christmas tree. Okay, fine, maybe it's not that great of a reward, but it's still better than getting something useless like a new skin for your guy or a "thank you for playing our game" message from the devs. Oh look! I mean, up until now, it would seem that there are no major complaints to be had on this title, so you would think I'd just give it my stamp of approval and call it a day, right? Just say it deserves better and move on and everybody's happy? Unfortunately, with Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos, there is one glaring issue with this game that I'd be remiss to not bring up. And this issue is an issue so glaring, so detrimental to the overall experience of Croc that it really does change everything. Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos, for whatever reason, uses tank controls. Tank controls are essentially an extremely archaic control scheme where you aren't allowed to move forward and make turns at the same time, or at minimum it makes doing so very hard. So basically, if you try to just make a simple right turn, Croc's not going to move in the direction of a right turn. What he will do is he will rotate his body in place to the right, and subsequently the camera will try to force itself to be directly behind Croc after he's made that turn. And that's the other thing about these detestable controls. The camera is absolutely committed to not staying in the same place for more than a few seconds, to the point where you pretty much have no control over it. You are completely at the mercy of the camera, so anytime you are trying to make it across a gap, it may just decide to not cooperate with you. Or it'll do something crazy like switch up on you and send you flying into the abyss. This is absolutely the worst thing Croc has going for it, so much so that it renders the game nearly unplayable to casual gamers. It was such a bad move to give Croc tank controls, especially in a 3D open space setting where freedom of movement is essential to the overall experience. And what makes it so detrimental to Croc as a game is that you can't escape it. It's everywhere. The camera is constantly shifting around on its own, and the sensitive controls are always trying to throw you off a ledge wherever the opportunity arises. There's this one section of the game in World 3 where the second you enter the room, the camera starts spazzing out on its own while you're doing literally nothing. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with here. It gets to the point where it starts to feel like the main challenge of the game isn't the platforming, or the boss fights, or the gameplay in general, but the camera and the bad controls. Speaking of the boss fights, they are often rendered unplayable because of the bad camera. You'll be running away from the boss and trying to gauge its attacks, but of course the camera is refusing to even let you see the boss, so you can't even plan your attack accordingly. And there are even sections where you can just tell that they were relying on the bad camera to make it more challenging for you, rather than the actual game design. Are you standing on a ledge that's about to drop into the abyss? Well, let's see how quickly you can turn yourself around to get off of it. Now, I know there is a feature implemented where you can tap the triangle button to snap Croc around 180 degrees, but that feature isn't as helpful when the camera just refuses to line up for you. It's sad, you know, really sad, because everything about Croc, the Legend of the Gobbos up to this point, has been really well executed. That total package I mentioned earlier, yeah, that's all there. It's all right here for you to make for a quality game, but there's just that one obtrusive mistake they made that muddies everything up.
That's no good.
Croc is a game that I really wanted to love. I like it. It's still a good time to me, especially after you get some practice. You can learn to mitigate the camera control issues. But at the end of the day, a system that flawed is something that no gamer should be forced to master. So, even though I personally still found the game enjoyable, I need to let go of my bias towards platformers and consider the effect it has on other people. With that said, no, Croc, The Legend of the Gobbos does not deserve better. It totally deserves its mixed reputation, because it's got a massive camera and control issue. An issue so bad that it actually manages to bleed into all other aspects of the game, thereby watering down the whole experience. It pains me to give Croc a bad verdict, because it is not a bad game at all. I swear there were times playing through it that felt almost magical to me, like I was completely zen because of how good a time I was having. And I was ready to declare this one of the most underrated games ever. Really, I was. Because I love Croc. I love the universe he lives in, and I really wish there had been a Croc 3. But hey, it's all good, because we still have Croc 2, and I am genuinely looking forward to checking that one out. Even if its controls are just as bad as this one.